And so here, just to kind of try to simplify it a little bit, there are lots of different types of connectivity. Here are three kind of general types that I'm going to talk about. One is core area or core or patch, and that's like a large intact habitat, area of habitat where animals and plants can move freely. And so those are just large contiguous areas of habitat. But there are other kinds of connectivity like linear corridors, which are like a strip of habitat that connects to core areas. And that could be something like a riparian corridor, like a stream. A lot of different animals tend to follow streams when they're traveling around different habitats. Or it could be something human-made, like a wildlife bridge or even a culvert. So it's just you know, a continuous area that connects the two areas of core habitat. And then there's also what we call stepping stone connectivity. And that consists of like small patches of habitat in between larger core patches of habitat. And so that's just another way animals can find their way to resources, whether they're in the little patches themselves or in the bigger core patches. And so an example of that would kind of be like migratory birds stopping in different places, stopping in our wetlands as they rest when they're, you know, migrating from Mexico to Alaska or Canada or something. That's kind of like large scale stepping stone connectivity. And so one question folks might have is why is connectivity important? Why is it important for all these different plants and animals? And there are several different reasons why it's important. One, which is really important, is that these populations need adequate gene flow. And so they need to be able to find enough individuals within their population so that they don't have to worry about inbreeding, because that could cause a lot of problems and impact their long-term survival. We also need connectivity because different habitats sometimes support different life stages of these species. So for example, amphibians have biphasic life histories. So they have aquatic larvae. Their eggs are, not all of them, but a lot of them, their eggs are laid in water. And then they have aquatic larvae. So they actually depend on that water to grow up and metamorphose. And once they become juveniles or adults, then they move on to terrestrial areas. And so we need to be sure there's connectivity for them to complete their entire life cycle. Otherwise, with just one, they can't necessarily survive without the other. Connectivity also allows for more access to resources, things like food, water, shelter, mates, and it also allows pollinators to move around so that the plants can get pollinated. And it also provides resilience to climate change. With changing temperatures and changing sea level, there's a lot of different things that these animals and plants need to adapt to, and they need the space to be able to do that. And so if they don't have these extra pathways that allow them to move, maybe to higher altitudes or to where the plants are moving to, then they'll get stuck and they won't be able to survive if they aren't able to get to that habitat. And so the types of connectivity can kind of range in scale. So for local connectivity is really important for smaller species that can't, or species that don't move as well, that are maybe a little bit slow, or just, you know, they are very, very particular and prefer very specific habitats that are very close together, maybe a couple miles, we'll say. And so I just put these pictures out here just to kind of give you an idea of the different species that, that really rely on local connectivity, whether it's between freshwater and upland grasslands or in riparian streams and the trees. And so these are a bunch of different species that occur in your area. You know, and so here's what I was talking about earlier. These are California newt egg masses. And so these are in a vernal pool where they'll hatch and they'll look a little bit like these guys here. This is a California tiger salamander larvae. So these are fully aquatic as well. You can see their little external gills, which is how they breathe when they're underwater. And then when they metamorphose, they leave those ponds. And a lot of times adults will spend much of their lives in burrows until it's time for them to breed again and go back to those vernal pools. And so here's a California giant salamander. And I just wanted to show this picture because I don't know if you see him, but the critter is right here in his little burrow. So they're also very cryptic. They tend to come out at night. Most salamanders tend to come out at night. And they tend to be more visible during the rainy season. But then it's not just, I'm a little partial to amphibians because I did study disease in amphibians, so that is kind of what I focused on for many years of my life. But there are also plenty of other critters that rely on local connectivity. Here's a deer mouse and garter snake, western pond turtle, and they all rely on these heterogeneous habitats to be able to get to these different places. And so local connectivity is really important for them. And then there's regional connectivity. So just a larger scale that's important for other species that might be more mobile, might have varied resources that are more spread out, might just require more space. So things like mountain lions actually have very large home ranges. They range from 75 to 200 square miles. And so they need a lot of space to be able to find food and have enough prey and find find mates. And similarly with bay checker spot butterflies also really need regional connectivity because again, that gene flow is really important for them to find other individuals from different populations nearby. And so there are a lot of animals that tend to move more. Also things like coyotes and badgers. So the mid to large animals, and then also a lot of birds need regional connectivity. And then there's continental connectivity. So there are a lot of species that I'm sure you all heard about that kind of migrate all throughout the U.S. and even further. And so it happens in the ocean, it happens on land. And just a couple examples, like monarchs, they migrate from Mexico to Canada, and then they have populations in California that migrate as well. And then our area is part of a Pacific flyway for birds. And there are, hundreds of millions of birds throughout the year migrate up and down our coast. And the San Francisco Bay Area has a lot of really important bird areas that have been identified by the Audubon Society, where, these shorebirds need to rest and refuel. And so those wetlands provide really important stopovers for some of those birds. And for others, they might come here to breed. And then when they're done breeding, they leave and they go back to Mexico or wherever they came from. And so it is just, connectivity can be, really pervasive. It's from small to huge scales. And so unfortunately, for these animals, there's a lot that we are doing that is impacting their ability to move through these landscapes. And not most impactful, but one of the most impactful things are roads and development that we're placing in their habitat. And so I just wanted to show these pictures just to give you an idea of like the wide array of species that that roads can impact, these are all vertebrates, from birds to reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and even fish. So this bottom picture on the left is a salmon trying to cross the road in an area where a road goes over a creek, and with storms being different now and sea level rise happening, a lot of these salmon are having trouble getting across to their upstream habitat to breed because of these roads. So there's a lot of fragmentation happening because of how we're placing these roads and development in their habitat, in these different habitats, without considering how they move and what they need for their life cycle to complete. And so the next slide has some graphic pictures. So I just want to warn folks on that. If you want to close your eyes for the next slide, I will let you know when that slide is over, but just wanted to warn you that it is a little bit graphic. So one of the big issues with roads being in these different species habitat is that there's actually one of the main impacts of roads is wildlife vehicle collisions. And so UC Davis, the Road Ecology Center at UC Davis comes out with a report every year. Over the last few years, they've come out with a report about once a year, and kind of providing statistics regarding those wildlife vehicle collisions and their impacts on animals and on people. And recently they came out with a special report, I think it was maybe 2 days ago that they published this report, kind of looking at the impact of, shelter and home, COVID-19 measures, and how that has affected wildlife vehicle collisions and wildlife vehicle conflict. Okay, the graphic photos are gone, so if anyone was closing your eyes, you can open your eyes now. It's much friendlier visuals now. So the findings of these reports, or what these the conclusions of these reports are that they estimate that 7,000 to 23,000 reported wildlife vehicle collisions occur every year in California, and this is only with large animals, right? And that's based on data from California Highway Patrol, Caltrans, and a community science observation program that is run by the Road Ecology Center. So 7,000 to 23,000 large animals are hit every year, and or are reported hit every year. And the estimated annual costs of that, from human life lost, human injuries, hospitalizations, and property damage are estimated to be $232 to $600 million every year. And which is already seems like so much. But one thing to keep in mind is that these collisions and these estimates are based on only reported collisions. And there's often, with these kinds of incidents, there's a lot of underreporting. And in some other states where they've done studies on what, like the percentage or how reporting versus not reporting these kinds of collisions, they found that underreporting can be 5 to 10-fold higher. And so there's just I think that just really shows how impactful roads can be on large animals, let alone all these other species. And what was interesting is that, with the study that came out a couple of days ago looking at COVID-19 related traffic, what they found was that there was and this is just in California again, and what they found was that 71%, there was a 71% decrease in driving, and that was measured by vehicle miles traveled. And there was a 21% reduction in total wildlife road mortalities. Again, that total wildlife is total large wildlife. And what was interesting is when they looked at the different specific species, they found that mountain lions had the highest impact, where there was a 58% reduction in mountain lion mortalities during the COVID shelter-in-place measures. And so I think, again, like the previous reports, this extra COVID report really amplifies how impactful these roads can be and traffic can be on the wildlife in an area. And as I said, it doesn't even account for all the other species that are being impacted. So if we look at birds, there was a study that came out that estimated that up to 340 million birds are killed on US roads every year. And then amphibians and reptiles are also really vulnerable to getting run over when they're migrating to their breeding pools. So it's really sad. And I just kind of wanted to highlight, you know, talking about amphibians and reptiles being really impacted. You know, they're really slow moving when they cross the streets and stuff. And for amphibians, some of them come out en masse when those rains hit the, you know, they get triggered to go to these breeding pools all at the same time. And so there were, I want to bring attention to this iNaturalist community science project, which was conducted in Lexington Reservoir in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So just a little bit south of us. And what the community scientists were concerned about, these newts, these California newts that were migrating to their breeding pool in Lexington Reservoir, being run over by cars on one road, right? So they did surveys during 2 breeding seasons. So that was basically November to March of 2018 and so 2018 to 2019, and then 2019 to 2020. And what they documented and what they found was that over 10,000 California newts were killed on that road in just those 2 years. And so that can have, to me, that is really, really sad. But that also can have really big impacts at a population level. So it's not just individuals that are being killed, but it's also what's happening with the population. Are they going to be able to persist in the long term? And that we don't know. It's hard to know. We would need to look at the population dynamics more, but that was a really great study done by community scientists to really show how the roads and development are impacting these small critters as well. So now that I showed you a lot of depressing statistics and a lot of really sad things, I do want to show you that there is hope. There are things that we can do to improve the situation for wildlife connectivity and wildlife movement. And it's, you know, being kind of implemented in some places more than others. But, you know, there are ways for us to implement crossings at existing barriers. You know, there can be wildlife bridges or overcrossings, which you can see deer are using here, and this is in Colorado. And, you know, there are culverts and underpasses that animals are using, and even, you know, here in the bottom is salamanders using salamander tunnels to cross streets. And so there are some ways that we can kind of help facilitate permeability for some species. And so that's kind of something that the center is working a lot on, trying to push for better mitigation to help improve wildlife movement. And so here I just wanted to give you an example of what kind of animals can be crossing on an overcrossing. This is a video from the Parley's Canyon wildlife crossing, which is in Utah, and they just completed this, I think less than a year ago. So I'll just let you guys get that. So what I like about that video is, one, that video, those cameras were put up right after the completion of that crossing, and you can see there was already quite a bit of variety of species that were crossing. There were deer, there were bobcats, mountain lion, there was a raccoon, coyotes, and so you know, I think that, you know, it may not be getting all the species that need to cross, but it is a good way to get some of those species to go across. And it reduces wildlife vehicle collisions. So that was an overcrossing. And I want to show you a video of an undercrossing just to show you the smaller critters that are moving through. And so this is an amphibian undercrossing in Vermont, and they built it knowing that they already knew that there were salamanders migrating in the area, and so they wanted to build it so that their populations could remain healthy and happy. And what's great about amphibian undercrossings is that there are other species that can use them too. So snakes, frogs, small mammals. And so this is a really quick video, and it's a little bit hard to see, but all the black splotches that are moving up the screen are little salamanders that are migrating to their breeding pools. And so while the crossings are really great and they really do help a lot, there is a lot that needs to go into kind of the design and consideration when these crossings are built, because it's one thing to have a physical barrier that then you might have physical connectivity, but it's not just the physical barrier that's the issue sometimes, because traffic is loud, it can be bright, and it can have a lot of vibrations, and that can affect how species behave. And so, even if there is a crossing, if it's too noisy or too bright, a lot of species might still avoid it because it's not something they're used to or comfortable going through or under or across. And so, we've seen, in terms of species behavioral shifts, we've seen, from songbirds to even like mountain lions, they'll avoid freeways during traffic times when the noise is really high. We've also seen changes in active times and changes in feeding habits based on human activities and human presence, and usually that means noise and light. And so it's really important to create these crossings and facilitate wildlife connectivity and wildlife movement by using a wildlife responsive design. And so that's something that really considers the species and what it needs, and it also these crossings need to have suitable habitat on both sides so that the animals can see, oh, there's something over there that I might want. There are these resources there that I think, I'll be able to find on the other side. So they have to have, motivation, I guess, and some facilitation for that movement. And another thing that would help is, when it's nighttime, those areas need to be dark. So a lot of times street lights can kind of prevent some animals from moving across these crossings. And same with, sound. Again, if we can find ways to make the entrances to the crossings darker and quieter, with sound berms or light barriers and things like that, then animals will be more likely to use the crossings, and then they can become more functional connectivity. And so we do have some wildlife crossings in California, but not very many. But I think we are starting to catch on. So there are other states in the U.S. and countries outside the U.S. that have been implementing crossings for quite a while. And so Arizona, Colorado, Utah, all these states have really started focusing more on building wildlife crossings, overpasses, underpasses, culverts. And they're starting to see and reap the benefits of these crossings. Where the crossings are built, they're seeing 80 to 96% reduction in wildlife vehicle collisions. And they're also seeing gradual increases in permeability. And so what that means is kind of, if you think back about the video where in Utah, where they had just finished building, and there were some species that, they adapted really quickly, and they, were down to use it as soon as that thing was done. There are other species that are going to be more wary, and they might take generations to learn to use those crossings and to know that they're safe. And so, but over time, what some biologists are seeing is that they are learning, and some of these crossings, when they're done properly, they are succeeding at facilitating wildlife movement for more species. And so when I say California is starting to catch on, they're starting to, or they're planning to build the world's largest wildlife bridge across the 101 in Southern California. And so this is in the LA area, and it's near the Santa Monica Mountains. And the main driver of this bridge being built is the mountain lion population in the Santa Monica Mountains. And so that population is suffering. It's just severely isolated. It has really high levels of inbreeding, and it really needs to be able, the mountain lions in that area really need to be able to disperse, and they need migrants to come in so that there can be more gene flow and they can be healthier and have a long-term survival. And so that was kind of the main driver of why that crossing is being built. But it's also going to be hopefully great connectivity for a lot of other species that are in the area as well. And that kind of, I wanted to use that to segue into some of the work that the Center for Biological Diversity has been doing regarding mountain lions. And I didn't realize that Zara would be speaking with you, so you'll probably hear about this a little bit more when she talks about the Puma project. But the center has been working a lot to conserve mountain lions, particularly in Southern California and along the Central Coast. And in June, we submitted a petition to list these mountain lions as threatened under the California Endangered Species Act. And right now, they're being considered, and so they're now candidate species under the California Endangered Species Act, or CESA is for short. And so my plan is to just talk to you a little bit about that and what that means. And so, you know, the reason we were motivated to petition for mountain lions in these areas to be listed is because a study came out in late 2018 that showed that that identified 10 genetically distinct populations of mountain lions throughout California, and most likely these populations were created because of habitat fragmentation due to human roads and development. And so, you know, after looking at that, what they found was that the mountain lions in Southern California, so in the Santa Monica Mountains, which is right here where it says CCS, this green spot, and the Santa Ana Mountains, which are down here, these populations are doing so poorly with genetic health that they're predicted to go extinct within 50 years if inbreeding gets worse than it already is. But it's not just the Southern California mountain lions that are struggling right now. There are mountain lions up here in the Santa Cruz Mountains where we are, and those mountain lions are also struggling because they're being severely isolated as well. And so what we decided to do at the center is, when we petitioned for the mountain lions to be protected under CESA, you know, we identified the populations that were most imperiled based on scientific studies. And what we propose is that, you know, the mountain lions in Southern California and along the Central Coast be listed under CESA. And so this black line that follows, you know, these freeways is the boundary that we propose. So everything in Southern and Central Coast California, we're hoping to get extra protections under CESA. And so, you know, I mentioned that genetic isolation due to fragmentation was a really big issue for these mountain lions, but there are numerous threats that these mountain lions are facing, and scientists have actually termed this an extinction vortex because there's just so many different things going against them. So not only do they have the genetic isolation, but they also have vehicle strikes on roads. About 100 mountain lions are killed every year on California roads, and again, that's reported. Biologists from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife actually estimate that it could be double that, and then historically, things might change now that they're candidate species, but that's yet to be determined. But prior to being listed, mountain lions, about 100 mountain lions were killed every year under depredation permits. And so those are legal permits. They're legally killed after they're suspected of killing livestock or pets. And so that's just another way that these lions are dying. There's also rat poisons that sometimes they make them really sick, and sometimes that they can succumb to other diseases, but also sometimes the rat poisons directly can kill these animals. And that's just, even though they're not the target species for these rat poisons, they might eat other animals that eat the rat poisons, and it bioaccumulates in their blood. And so that's how it makes them really sick. They also die from poaching and other diseases, and several have died in the wildfires these past couple years. And then again, climate change. And so there are all these things that are just not favoring mountain lions and their survival. And the primary driver of all these issues is lack of connectivity. And so, as I mentioned, they have huge home ranges, and they just have they need a lot of space. So connectivity is really important for their survival. And so some of you might be wondering, well, why are they so vulnerable to fragmentation? And I alluded to this a little bit ago, and just now. But so one is their large home ranges, and because of those large home ranges, they also have a really low density. Male mountain lions have their territories, and they do not like to overlap with other male mountain lions, but they're okay with overlapping with some female mountain lions, but not that many. And so, with a 75 to 200 square mile home range, there's just not going to be a lot of lions in any given area at one time. And they're also opportunistic hunters. So, they eat whatever they can get their paws on, deer are their main prey, but they also eat coyotes, they eat, raccoons, porcupines, skunks, and, unfortunately that means they also eat livestock, and pets if they're not kept in lion-proof enclosures at night, or if they're kept at home, inside home. So, and then that can lead to conflicts, and then therefore the depredation permits. And so, I think that aspect of their life history also kind of makes it difficult for them facing all these problems. And then one other thing is that they seem to be scared of people. They generally avoid us. There have been studies that have shown, that they tend to stay further away from the urban edge as much as they can. And I mean, I think one story that comes to mind when I think about this is, there was a mountain lion that was killed in the Woolsey fire, which was in Southern California. And that lion had a collar. So mountain lion researchers at National Park Service could look at those data and see where he was moving. And so when the Woolsey fire hit, they could see that, and this is like looking at retro data, so they could see that he had been running away from the burn, from the flames. Then he came up against an urban area. And instead of running through the urban area to escape the fire, he didn't want to get into that urban area, and he actually ran back towards where all the land was burning. And he didn't die in that fire, but he, his body was later found a couple weeks later, and his paws were burned and he had starved. And so, it wasn't direct, but it was still, caused the Woolsey fire. And if there was better connectivity and a way for him a pathway to get out to another area, he could have survived. So, You know, I think that's just one example of how mountain lions generally avoid people, but there are other ways too. Whoops. So some of you might be wondering, well, okay, maybe they're struggling and they're not doing well, but you know, why should we protect them? And you know, there are several reasons. I'm sure there are lots more reasons than what I have up here on the slide. But one reason is just their intrinsic value. They're an iconic species. They're the last remaining large carnivore in these areas of California because they're the only ones who survived predator extermination campaigns in the early 1900s. So grizzly bears and wolves were completely extirpated by people, but these mountain lions somehow were able to persist. And it's pretty amazing that they're still here and in such close proximity to some of our urban areas. But not only, some people might just really love mountain lions for them being mountain lions, but they're also really important for our ecosystem health, and because they are ecosystem engineers. They provide a reliable food source with the kills that they have. So again, usually their main prey is deer, at least in this area, their main prey is deer. And what they do with once they kill a deer is that they'll feed at night and rest during the day. And so when they're resting, they actually cache their prey and they hide it and they bury it, right? But when they're not near their kill, a lot of scavengers benefit from this reliable food source. So raptors, foxes, black bears, California condors, all sorts of animals are able to benefit from their kills. And not only that, but they also, a lot of insects and invertebrates benefit from their kills as well. And so insects and invertebrates are really good indicators of environmental health and ecosystem health. And so it's good to have those, that biodiversity in an area. And, you know, as I said, they bury their prey. And so when they're done with the scraps, you know, sometimes those just stay in the soil, and then fungi and molds can get to it. And then there's really nutritious soil for vegetation. And so they really provide a really important service that helps support a lot of biodiversity. But not only are their kills important, they also, just their presence makes everyone kind of behave differently. So their prey and other small carnivores like coyotes and badgers and foxes, they all behave differently if there's a mountain lion around. And that can change the structure of habitats. So if, you know, deer have no fear at all and aren't worried about anything, they might, you know, browse all the vegetation along the stream bank. But if they know mountain lions around, they're a little more wary, so they might just browse for a little bit of time and then find somewhere else. And that actually allows vegetation to grow, and that helps keep banks stabilized, stream banks stabilized. And so that, in keeping the stream bank stabilized, we then can help keep the water clean, and that's habitat for lots of different fish, amphibians, reptiles, and then there's more vegetation along the stream so that they support songbirds or any other kind of animals that rely on these habitats. So that's why they're often called keystone species or ecosystem engineers, because they do seem to play a big role in the biodiversity of these areas. And then another reason to protect them could be also self-serving. If we protect them and make crossings more available to them, then we also make the roads safer for people to drive on. And so, you know, just to reiterate, you know, in other places, we're seeing up to 96% reduction in wildlife vehicle collisions where we have crossings. And so that would be really awesome in much of our state. And so one of the reasons we, you know, when we were thinking about do we want to petition for these protections under CESA, we wanted to look at what existing laws were and if they were doing enough. And we really just don't think they were doing enough. And so Prop 117 was passed in 1990 by California voters, and it banned the sport hunting of mountain lions. And so people haven't been allowed to hunt mountain lions in California for 30 years. But even despite that ban, some populations within California still have lower rates of survival than many hunted populations outside of California. And so, again, that's mostly due to roads getting hit on cars and depredation permits, right? And so, the ban on sport hunting didn't necessarily reduce the number of animals being killed. And then also, in those 30 years, roads and development have continued to fragment mountain lion habitat in a way that doesn't allow them to move through. And so we felt that they needed more protections so that they could help, we could help them sustain healthy populations throughout the state. And so, there are several things that CESA listing would do. First is, this is probably among multiple different things. I'm probably not covering everything, but some of the things that CESA listing could do for mountain lions in Southern California along the Central Coast is it could have a really beneficial impact on land use planning and land use planning decisions. And so CESA listing would encourage the preservation of existing natural corridors, and also call for more innovation in mitigation to minimize impacts to line movement where we do develop. And it would require developers to consult with state wildlife experts to determine how to best minimize those impacts to line movement. It would also encourage greener infrastructure. So kind of what we've been talking about this whole time, with more wildlife bridges, more culverts and underpasses, more protected habitat. And it would also, encourage limited use of rodenticides. And then CESA listing would also allow for the development and implementation of a recovery plan by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And they could, kind of look at the status of these populations and plan accordingly to help improve their chances for long-term survival. And so right now we're still in the middle of the CESA process. So I'm just going to kind of summarize a little bit, summarize a little bit of what the process is. But basically we submitted that petition in June of 2019. And then in February of 2020, California Department of Fish and Wildlife recommended that listing may be warranted, which just means that they think they should be considered for listing under CESA. And that went to a California Fish and Game Commission vote, which happened in April, and they voted to advance these lions to candidacy. And what that means is that they kick off a year-long status review that CDFW will do. And during that status review, CESA protections will apply. And then we expect that in June of 2021, that CDFW will publish their recommendation and provide it to the California Fish and Game Commission, who will then likely vote in August on whether or not to formally list these mountain lions under the California Endangered Species Act. So it is kind of a long process, and there are a lot of steps, but we overcame a pretty big step in April when they voted these lions to candidacy, and so we're hopeful that they'll get the protections that they need in the long term, and that mostly means more connectivity. And so that's pretty much it. I just wanted to leave you all with this other video that I think is really uplifting. I don't know, maybe many of you have seen it before, but this video was taken in the Santa Cruz Mountains by the Peninsula Open Space Trust. And So scientists there are monitoring existing culverts that are underneath freeways to see if there's potential for connectivity there. So this is a video from one of those culverts that went viral because it's really cute and it's really awesome to see this. So. So I love that video because I just, from that video, it made me do a bunch of research with coyotes and badgers and do they hang out all the time? And it turns out that they sometimes hunt together. And so I think those two were on their way to maybe grab some breakfast. So I don't know, I just thought that was fun and I wanted to share that with you. And so that's it. If you have any questions or anything, I'm ready.
Well, Tiffany, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. I'm going to give the participants a bit of time to formulate their questions and just discuss these overland bridges. The one that you showed, the overland one, which was used right away.
In Utah?
Yes, it didn't even seem to have any vegetation on it except some rocks. And so I'm going, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is a desire to have these bridges sort of made green and with vegetation, I suppose, for them to cross, at least to make them feel more at home.
Sure. Yeah. You know, I think it depends on the surrounding habitat because there are some habitats where I'm not totally sure where exactly that crossing is in Utah, but there's some habitats like desert habitats that might look like that where it's really dry and there's not a lot of vegetation, but there's big rocks and little rocks. And so there's still those boulders amongst the small little pebbles on that bridge do provide cover for smaller animals. But you're right, there, you know, for other, depending on where it is, you know, they're like for the Liberty Canyon crossing in LA,
Mm-hmm.
you know, they're gonna, more vegetation would facilitate numerous other species from to be able to move across because, you know, little deer mice, they aren't going to feel comfortable going across a big open thing like that. They want places of cover. They want little logs or vegetation that they can hide in.
Mm.
Same for snakes, you know, same for salamanders. And so there's, it really depends on the target species that you want to be crossing, right? And so for the Utah crossing, you know, I think the main goal was for the big game animals.
Mm-hmm.
So like elk and deer, bears. And so, you know, I think for those guys, the openness, and that's why one of the having an overcrossing is a really good thing for them because they really like that openness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, their animals are a lot more hesitant to go into a dark tunnel, hoping they get out on that other bright side. They'll do it, but more animals would be more willing to go on an overpass. So it varies, and it really depends on the species that you're trying to get moving.
Mm-hmm. And the vegetation there, as you say, that is probably maybe quite sparse anyway in the first place, so that something like that fits the bill.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me check here. There is a question regarding creating corridors along Highway 280. Have you heard anything to that effect?
About creating corridors along 280?
Yep.
I personally have not heard about that. That is definitely something that, you know, I think 280, just in the past year or so, I've heard of quite a few roadkill incidents with mountain lions, but also with deer. And I know that there's one area on the 280 that's like, I don't know if popular is the right word, but it's an area that's known for wildlife vehicle collisions. And so I'm not sure what the status is on whether or not there are existing culverts that can get upgraded, or if they're planning to build crossings there. I haven't heard about that specifically. So I'm sorry, I can't answer. That's probably not satisfactory answer for you. I'm sorry.
Well, the thing is that we have a question here from Judy who says, do we have more plans to build more animal corridors? Because it seems like there is a great need, whether it's Highway 1, whether it's 280. And it seems, of course, that from the mountain lions and any large game, that they've reached the point here in Pacifica and San Francisco where they can't go anywhere because they're surrounded by water. They've reached the point of no return. So if they can cross east to west, west to east, rather than north,
Yeah. No, I totally agree. That we definitely, there's a dire need for more crossings for all sorts of species. And I know of one crossing that is being planned for, and that's by Highway 17. So it's a little bit south. It's in the Santa Cruz Mountains. But that crossing is wildlife only, and it's the target is mountain lions, but also bobcats and coyotes in that area. And so that's been in the works for a little bit. Scientists have been studying those areas to see where the best spot is or multiple spots to kind of facilitate that animal movement. But that, again, I totally agree. I think we need more. That's definitely not enough. But for some reason, we're California, all throughout California, hasn't been moving as quickly on this as other states have.
And that is unfortunate. Mm-hmm. That is truly unfortunate. Lawrence asks, you mentioned Highway 17. He's asking, any salamander tunnels proposed for Lexington/Highway 17?
Oh, I wish. Not that I'm aware of. I do know that, so when that iNaturalist project got media attention, that was in 2019. So that was after the first year that they were documenting those roadkill. And that got a lot of attention. And I think people are really advocating for something there. There's lots of different ways that you can address it. I personally am not super familiar with the road routes there, so I don't know if there are other roads alternatives. But I know that in Tilden, out in Berkeley, there are a lot of newts there that migrate in one specific area, and so they actually close the road from November to March, so that people hopefully don't hit them, at least on that segment of the road. It causes a little bit of inconvenience for folks who live in the area, but they've been doing that for years, and so that's really helped the population. One thing about building those tunnels is that it does get expensive, and so that's often a no pun intended roadblock for these projects. But I also saw a study that was done in Yosemite for Yosemite toads, and what they did was they took scraps from like some other construction projects, and they built an elevated road along this area where they knew that Yosemite toads were crossing. And so, and that elevated road could take, like, semis were driving on it, and it was staying up and holding. And so what they found, they actually found a pretty cheap way to build this like extended tunnel for these Yosemite toads. And then it's not just those, it's all the small critters were able to use that area. And so that was an awesome success story. Unfortunately, those kinds of elevated roads are temporary because they do over, they think over several years, they might need to get replaced. But it is another option. And so, I don't know of any specific plans for tunnel or anything like that happening at Lexington Reservoir. But, my guess is, we're pushing for it, and I think others are too, because more and more groups are getting involved with that community science project.
And are the, Joanne is asking whether the pumas on Pedro Point headland are isolated or are they connected to an existing corridor? Is the north-south from Santa Cruz Mountains, are the pumas in any way, are they connected? Can they move up, or is it so disconnected that they can't?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And, there's a researcher at UC Santa Cruz who actually studies this population in depth. So he collars the animals. His name is Chris Wilmers. He collars the animals, and he kind of knows what their movements are like. With mountain lions in an isolated place, I'm sorry, I'm not super familiar with the Pedro Peak that you're talking about, but my guess is, so we see about 100 mountain lions getting hit on roads every year, but there's definitely way more crossings happening than 100. And so there are times where animals are able to successfully cross at grade. It's dangerous, but it happens. And then it just takes one car hit to wipe it out, right? So I would say that, in general, if there are roads and development in the way, that they could get pretty isolated, but also, there are, depending on traffic and I guess in the number of people there and the population size in that area, there are potential ways for them to get to the Santa Cruz Mountains. And if you remember that map that I showed you with the different colors, where the Santa Cruz Mountains were, it actually included all the way up to basically the city of San Francisco, and it included all of the Diablo range. And so that's one genetic group, which means they're connected in some way, but that doesn't mean that those connections are not tenuous, because if you think about the Diablo range and the Santa Cruz Mountains, the 101 basically bisects right through them. And so those connections are limited. I don't know if that answers your question as much as you'd like. So
well, Pedro Point is very much here on the west, across the it's on the west side of Highway 1, and okay. People, it's right here in Pacifica, and
oh, gotcha.
So we're wondering. Joanne was wondering whether this is an isolated population, just like we're seeing so many mountain lions in Pacifica now, whether on streets, whether in the park, in San Pedro Valley Park, where in reality, from what I understand from people and from my own experience, the sightings were very, very few indeed. And now there are many more sightings, and people can't quite explain or understand why we have so many sightings of mountain lions. Are they, is it just that they're having so many young and yet there's no place for them to go? Or is it that they're in a way isolated in this area and can't seem to go anywhere and connect either north or, east, west, south, north, sure. Because it's water,
yeah, no, that's a good point. And I would say that in terms of the more sightings, I don't know if that has to do with people paying more attention to their cameras, having more cameras out. It could be that the same mountain lion is being caught on different cameras, because sometimes it can be very difficult to know if it's one mountain lion or 5 mountain lions. It could be the same one. It could be all different ones. So there's that. but there's also, there are, like, I don't know if you heard about the mountain lion that was in downtown San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And that one, it was 50 pounds. So that means it was really young. It was probably 2 years old or younger. And so mountain lions, they generally, their young stay with the mom for up to 2 years, and then they disperse. And so it could be that, dispersing young or kind of popping up in places where maybe there are more homes and more people because they're looking for their own territory. And if there are stable adults that already have their established territories, they might fight off these young. And so the young kind of get pushed out, and they might be getting pushed out into these areas where people are seeing them more. So that could be also another explanation of why folks are seeing them more right now. Also, based on that UC Davis report and the reduced traffic, that's going to be something where mountain lions are going to be moving around a little bit more freely because the traffic and the traffic noise is way less. So
thank you. And then we have a couple more questions about who actually is responsible for greasing, who greases the wheels to get these highway wildlife crossings made? That's like the crux of this. We need them, and who actually makes it feasible to have these crossings built? Either over whichever way it is, but
no, so it's complicated, but the agencies that would be building these structures, this infrastructure, would be Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation, and so they're kind of they have the very big task of keeping our roads and highways safe. Safe for people and safe for wildlife. But I think, for some reason there's been, it's been difficult to get that going. I think a lot of it has to do, and this is just personal opinion. I think a lot of it has to do with funding. There's always different projects looking for more funding, and, expanding roads and maintaining roads and fixing roads. And there's generally been less focus on wildlife safety, even though there's a human safety component to that. But, in terms of how do we make this happen, this is something that we've been advocating for a long time, and we hope that mountain lion protections are provided through CESA, and that will help push these kinds of crossings along. But also, writing letters to your representatives and letting them know that you think this is a really important issue and you want them to address it. A lot of times these kinds of things start at the local level. I think Highway 17 is a really good example of that, where it was a local community that was really pushing for these studies to be done, and they got, so many different organizations involved. MidPen was involved, Post, Santa Clara Valley Habitat Agency, and many other. I think Caltrans is actually involved in that one too. And so it takes a lot of collaborators, and it takes a lot of persistence. And I think more and more Caltrans is starting to recognize that they need to do more, but there is still the money.
Money, yes.
Yeah.
Well, even when there's a lot of money, there seems to be no money for things that the environmentalists need and consider important. So now we're in the hole, and then again they're going to say there's no money. So I'm not too sure about this. No money. There's never any money.
Yeah.
But Yes.
One thing that's sorry to interrupt, but one thing that has been interesting to me to kind of observe and see how things play out is the Liberty Canyon crossing in LA. That crossing cost $87 million. Yeah, it costs a lot, and not all of that money is going to come through state funding. For I think we all could have guessed that. But there's a lot of, so they're relying a lot on donations and crowd funding, and so it's an interesting thing. And I think one thing to keep in mind with that, like that, I mean, that's a huge one. It's going to be the biggest one in the world, and it's going to cross a 10-lane freeway, with LA traffic. And so that's an extreme kind of case in terms of cost and construction build. But, there are ways to make it a lot cheaper. We can try to avoid areas where we know that our natural linkages and good mountain lion habitat. We can try to avoid building roads there. We can also upgrade existing potential crossings like culverts. So there are a lot of culverts all over. Not all of them are perfect or good for wildlife movement, but some are. We just have to find out which ones those are, and then we can upgrade them. So if Caltrans needs to go fix a pothole on a road, or if there's a road expansion project and there's a culvert there that if it just got upgraded, we could enhance connectivity, then that should go in the project description, and that could be part of the project and the funding. That would be a much cheaper way to fix the problem, because you're already there and you already have to fix something nearby. You might as well just include that as well. So there are definitely, and like the Highway 17 crossing also is not $87 million.
No, obviously not.
Yeah.
You're crossing 10 lanes of freeway.
Yeah.
Plus from the beginning through to the end, considering all the preliminary planning and everything that has to go into play, get done and analyzed all the way through to the end. Well, yes, over such a very busy section, yes, one can imagine that it's going to be costly. And then Joanne is following up with, do you know of any partnerships that have been formed between local land trusts or habitat restoration efforts, Golden Gate National Recreation, and any other county parks with an eye to increasing wildlife corridors? Is there anything where there's already partnerships that exist, where if one decides to write, that there's already a central hub, so to speak, where maybe something will happen?
Yeah, that's a great question that I wish I had a better answer for. The one that comes to mind is the one that I already mentioned, and that's Midpen and Post and Caltrans.
Big Pen?
So I'm sorry, Midpen. So Mid-Peninsula.
Midpen.
Yeah. They do a really great job working with. A lot of their land is some of it is grazing lands, and so they do a lot of really great work with ranchers that are on their lands. But they're really good with local community work, and so I think they have been working mostly with, again, Post and Pathways for Wildlife is an organization that does a lot of the studies there on wildlife movement in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and local stakeholders. And so I think that is one kind of like partnership collaboration that is really great, and one that I know of. There aren't really any others that come to mind right now, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. I just may not be aware of them, or they just might not be popping up into my brain right now.
Bing is saying, thanks, great talk. Could have a wildlife bridge cause predator and prey to interact more frequently than not? Could a wildlife bridge cause predator and prey interaction more frequently than not?
Oh,
are there problems with these
gotcha.
crossings where,
Yeah, I think I know what you're alluding to, Bing. I think it's, so I've heard of this too, where, you know, are predators waiting at the entrance or exit of a crossing for like a deer to pop out. And so we're like, would crossings potentially be an attractant, I guess, to some degree, or some sort of baiting? And that's a really good question. That is definitely something that comes up when folks are talking about the design of these crossings and how they want them to work and if they work or not. And I honestly don't know if there are any studies that have been published showing that that is in fact what happens. I think most of the studies that I've come across and most of the reports that I've come across are more about the wildlife permeability, and there hasn't really been any reports or that many documentations of that happening.
and then Lawrence is saying, is the Getty contributing to the Liberty Valley overpass?
Oh.
No,
That's a good question. I'm not involved in the fundraising for that. So I'm not totally sure who has been engaged on that. I heard, so National Wildlife Federation is the main organization that is fundraising for the Liberty Canyon crossing. And the last time I spoke to Beth, who is part of that organization, I remember her telling me that the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation donated money there. I don't think they're called that anymore, but yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if the Getty has contributed to that.
And Lauren says, thanks very much. And then we have, let me check. I think there's a big thank you from Kathy and Gary Johnson to everyone, especially to you, obviously.
Yeah.
Let's see. And then there's this video that supposedly it's www.youtube.com/watch with a question mark. And I mean, we can post this to those who participated. It's got a whole bunch of letters and numbers, but it's deals with it deals with this topic from a few years ago. It mentions designs that drops the price of connecting bridges.
Oh, great.
So we will post this to those who are, who have participated, and hopefully that will. But I'm wondering, just Tiffany, if one addresses one group of people, like for instance, if one addresses an organization like Caltrans, is that enough, or does one have to address as many as you can for the same issue?
Yeah, ooh, that's a good question. In terms of for advocacy for something like this, I think it has to go more political as opposed to Caltrans. So,
to the representatives,
senators and representatives. Yeah, and that I can actually. We have the center actually has a letter template that I can send you a link to that goes directly to California senators and representatives. So
that would be helpful. We could then again forward that to all participants.
Yeah.
That would be lovely.
I can email that to you. Yep.
I think there are some people who are very, very gung-ho on terms of doing something.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's great. Yeah, I mean, the more voices we hear, the better. I mean, it's definitely, it makes a difference when the public voices their opinion about things like this. And, you know, I think that was something that really came out with the whole process with the Mountain Lion California Endangered Species Act petition. There was really strong support from a majority of the public, and I think that really played a role in how, you know, the Fish and Game Commission looked at this issue. It's, you know, they're supposed to look at it purely from a scientific point of view, like, are these animals at risk of extinction? But, you know, I think having, you know, the public speak up and talk about how important mountain lions are to them and why they want them protected, I think that helps a lot too.
Mm. But then one can address not only mountain lions, but just animals needing a pathway that will let them get from one point to another for all the various reasons that you mentioned, from genetics to food, to just
Mates and reproduction,
home range, to whatever, you know, to get from water to land, that they're close enough that whatever connectivity needs to be made has to be available.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that California is you know, I thought California was very proactive in terms of the environment, but it doesn't seem to be with regards to, it's beginning to be, but it's sort of lagging behind other states, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Which
it's disappointing. But I think there's, you know, definitely that's why we're pushing for it more, and you know, really advocating for wildlife connectivity, and you know, getting more crossings, getting greener infrastructure, getting greener development too. You know, I think there are a lot of ways that we can improve, and it might take some innovation, but I think that's something that California is good at, and hopefully they take on the challenge. Really, it's a lot of this is more about, you know, shifting mentality and attitude about, you know, the importance of these things. Because I think, you know, again, there is the intrinsic value of these animals and biodiversity, you know, from salamanders, kit foxes, and so on. But it benefits us too, because if we have healthy ecosystems, we get so many services from those ecosystems. We get better water quality. We get, you know, buffers from storms that are going to be, you know, gearing up, because as climate change changes things, and, you know, we're going to have better carbon sequestration with healthy ecosystems. And so there's a lot of ways where, you know, it's for us, the focus is wildlife and wild places, but it actually also benefits a lot of people too.
Well, Barbara Daly wants to thank you for this very informative talk. We'll look forward to updates in the future, and we'll definitely have to have you back to see how things are moving along in this very, very important area. It really does behoove us to see if all of us can help in some way by either writing or bugging some entity somewhere in some political establishment in terms of trying to get roadkill down in order to get connectivity up and improve the life of animals of every nature, every kind, and help us.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you so much for being with us and for being so generous and answering all the questions. I know I've kept you way beyond what we thought would be. It would be a nice quick hour, right?
Oh, no worries. I'm happy.
I know it never works that way. That's why I say I kidnap you guys for 2 hours or whatever. So I'm up front right away at 4 o'clock. Yeah, you're here for 2 hours. That's it. You know, don't even think of going anywhere.
Well, I'm happy to answer your questions. And if anything comes up, or if you want to get a hold of me, feel free to email me or call me. No
But
worries.
please forward me that or email me that letter, you know, that, and
I will.
I will make sure it gets to all the people, all the participants, and
Okay.
even to all the friends. So
Okay.
that we have people who may write.
Yeah, that's great. That would be great. Yeah, I'll send you that and maybe some other info that
Excellent.
if you think folks will be interested, you can pass it
Right.
along.
So thanks a million. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
Great photos. Great photos. This one's a charmer. Absolute charmer. I want it. I want it.
Yeah. No, they're cute. They were just born like a couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago.
They are so cute.
Yeah, they're really cute. So,
anyway.
Okay.
All
right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tiffany. It was lovely meeting you.
Yes, you too. And have a good evening.
You too. Have a great dinner.
Thanks.
You
Bye.
earned it.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.